All right. Everybody's back. We're still talking about navigable tidal waters. More rules. The Civil Code. This is a code of how to deal with civil matters and what to do when issues come up. It has been codified for you. And so you sort of get a leg up about what you do in order to interpret what are water boundaries. Section 1014, and we're going to start to get into what happens if boundaries change and when they change. We know water boundaries are not static. Stuff happens. Where, from natural causes, land forms by imperceptible degrees upon the bank of a river or stream, imperceptible is the key word here, navigable or not, doesn't matter, either by accumulation of material or by the recession of the stream, so all of a sudden you have land appear, such land belongs to the owner of the bank subject to any existing right-of-way. What's that mean? That means that accumulation, if it's natural, in its natural state, will provide ownership to the riparian owner. Okay. On the other side, the rules of engagement says accretion meaning to acquire or to attach itself, if it's gradual and imperceptible and incurs gain or loss, then that will add to title. In other words, you will either gain or lose land if it's natural. If, where are we here? Okay. The land so formed is added to that of the owner of the bank. And title to riparian land passes title to accreted land unless the contrary intent is indicated. There have been some instances wherein somebody says, you know, if you get any extra land, I'm going to acquire title to that, or I retain title to that, or I retain the ability to travel over it because I'm right next door and I may need that. Federal law provides for accretions to be owned along navigable shore, but California cases have provided for state ownership if a substantial time elapses between the original survey and entry, called the unjust enrichment of a landowner. I like that phrase. Okay, what does that mean? That means that in a case between California, where they were the plaintiff and brought suit against the United States in Mono Lake, because Mono Lake receded and because Mono Lake was part of an original GLO survey, that since it receded and since it would normally, by the recession of waters in a natural way, since it would inure or be embodied in the federal government, that the federal government should have gotten it, but, and this is a federal court that said this, but because it's been so long before entry by the United States that that property belongs to the state of California. That is a federal site right there, so 85 of the Federal Reporter's second, page 857 is how you read that, and that was only in 1986. Again, it is remarkable how recent a lot of these decisions have come down. All right, gain, shoreline changes, accretion, artificial deposition of land due to works of man. Artificial we're talking about. California does not recognize artificial accretions as creating title that attaches to the land. Artificially created land next to tidal waters belongs to the state, the owner of the underlying bed. Why? Well, it's been the California rule that since we are the sovereign and you, man, had a hand in creating the accretion, then that does not, because you can affect title to your own property, attach to your own property. We still retain the public right, the public sovereign title to the land on sovereign, what was formerly sovereign beds of water. Public trust ownership of the bed cannot alienate the trust easement from trust lands. But distance may matter. Public trust doctrine permits loss of a public trust property by natural accretion, but not by artificial accretion. Okay. This is a 1995 case. California ex rel, again, through its relationship with the State Lands Commission, versus the Superior Court of Sacramento County, Lovelace et al. What happened was, on the Sacramento River, because back during the gold rush, and we're talking 1850s, there was a lot of hydraulic mining way upstream. The hydraulic mining created a lot of alluvium that moved downstream. But, the court said, although it's artificial, it is carried to the site by a natural means, and it is so far away from the site of the original source of the material that we're going to consider that natural. So distance matters, possibly, in considering whether or not the accretion is natural or artificial. The court here, I think the court affirmed that the owner of the accreted lands who was private, still retained ownership of accreted land, where the state said, no, that all of a sudden accreted over sovereign territory. Rules of engagement for loss. The general rule is gradual and imperceptible creates title, or creates title in that loss of land. In other words, if you lose it through natural causes, your title line moves with that loss. Here is sort of a graphic. And we've got littoral drift. In other words, the current comes down through here. The natural shoreline was along through here. Somewhere along the line, we don't know who. Was it the state? Was it a private owner? We don't know. We don't really care. But there are artificial accretions because what will happen is the material will drop out here and scour back in through here and create erosion here and accretion here. What happens to the shoreline? Does all of a sudden this upland owner get out to there and down and through there? No. The California rule says it stays in its last natural state. Kind of hard to find when the last natural state is actually underneath some of the fill and some of the groins and some of the riprap that gets put in order to extend it and put a road there. All right. The rule, Civil Code 1015. Again, we have a codified method of analyzing what the boundaries are. If a river or stream, navigable or not navigable, carries away by sudden violence a considerable and distinguishable part of a bank and bears it to the opposite bank, in other words, if it cuts it off and moves it over, or to another part of the same bank, cuts it off and it sort of kind of washes around, the owner of the part carried away may reclaim it within a year after the owner of the land to which it has been united takes possession thereof. That doesn't mean you can go dig it up and bring it back and stick it in the water. What it means is, if it happens to have been separated from your riparian boundary, you can reclaim that. Because it's avulsive, you can reclaim use of that within a year that it happens, that the avulsion happens. I don't have a court case that covers that. The general rule is sudden and perceptible does not incur gain or loss through avulsion. And avulsion will not cause change of boundary from riparian or littoral owner. Avulsion can have several different instances and several different conditions which it creates. We're going to see a graphic here in a minute. The avulsed owner can recover land so separated within a year. We just talked about that because it's in a civil code. Jane, we'll see that in a minute, does not lose her property now bisected by the new channel. The change in direction or location of water moves riparian banks or shore away from a former riparian or littoral owner, and that owner ceases to be a riparian owner. Is it fair? No. Is it law? Yes.
I was going to say it seems contrary to this notion that increasing riparian owners have access to water.
Understood. What can I say? This is a court determination that it is sudden and avulsive. It is not your fault, and therefore it changes. Now we're going to see in a minute. Yes?
How did they prove that it happened? Did they have to have some sort of survey or proof that where it was before this event?
I'm going to tell you something. I have seen the efforts gone through to show where land was after something avulsive has happened, and it's extensive. People get into historical records. Where was it? How far was it? Because you have a lot to lose and say, well, I now gain that area that is now cut off or not. And so I guess the answer to your question is yes, a survey is generally needed. Possibly not, but it almost always encourages that. You need to know where it is and how far and how much. I would think that would be an integral part of any court case. Okay.
With a bulk land, when you reclaim it in its new location?
Correct. Because you can't dig it up and bring it back.
So you just go in there and say, that's my land, and
Be nice to me.
it's your screen.
It's what? Oh, what happened there? Oh, you know what, boys and girls? Small detail.
Well, now we're in public.
One moment, please. Have we got a plug up here, Russell? Cool. Yeah, it'll be good. Oh, here you go. That's my end. That's your end. I don't know. Surge protector. I don't know. Yeah, I do. Let me plug it in behind me. I'll trip over that. Thanks. Here we go. Went into hibernation mode. Well, this will be interesting. We'll see shortly. I got to get back on the screen here. Okay. I think, boys and girls, we may have one of those situations where I'm just going to have to carry forth in order to get this rolling. So while we're doing this.
You have it on your screen?
No. I think we just got all confused here. Not unlike the speaker. All right? So we'll just get it rolling again. We can recover.
Surveyors improvise.
Surveyors have to improvise. Okay, so we're sparking up again. We'll see what happens here. Where were we? What we were talking about is the avulsed land. It would really be helpful to have this up here. So I guess the premise is this. You're right. Let's do that. You get to see my artwork and my artistic capability here. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do this. Two properties, both riparian owners. Okay, here's to this. This is Jane. This is Joe. Now, this is where the original channel is. This is the river. It flows in through here, and an avulsion happens to all of a sudden change that river to over here. Okay? This is the new. This is the old. Okay. A couple of different situations exist in which we do or don't know and can surmise and can talk about. Joe owns to this bank here. We're going to start and say this is a non-navigable, non-tidal river, obviously. So where do they own to?
Middle.
Jane owns right here. All of a sudden now, we may be back up and running here in a minute. Boat.
One back.
You can never have too many boats.
Right.
I don't care what anybody tells you. All right, so let's see this. And you know what we're going to do here? I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to do something cool. I'll do this while I'm doing it. I can do two things at once. So what happens is the avulsion comes along, sudden and perceptible, and changes the channel up over to here. Now, what we don't know is there water here? And is there water here? If there is water here, we're going to talk about that in a minute, that says all of a sudden this becomes an island. That's a different rule of engagement. This, if there is no water there and there's now water flowing there, what happens? Rules of engagement say that the boundary is still the middle of that channel. However, Jane now has an avulsed channel with water flowing through it, and Joe no longer has a riparian property. Is it fair? No. Is it the law? Yes.
Is that only if Jane acts within 1 year?
In that particular case we're talking about, no, that is the way it is. I mean, and besides, Joe would have no recourse to obtaining anything because that's not his to go and enter and obtain. And so I'm going to go like this and say OK and see if this works. While we're doing this, be nice to me. Catch them both. All right. Okay. Function. Okay, boys and girls, I saw it. I saw it was there. It's still not doing it. Okay, whatever. I'll get this rolling, then we'll keep talking. So at this point, we're saying that that's non-tidal, non-navigable, and Jane now has a river running through her property, and Joe is out of luck. What if that is a navigable river, okay? What is if that's a navigable river, and what happens if that now has flow through it? Or what if that was a navigable river and that has flow through it? Any comments? Any surmises? Okay. What happens is this: if there is no water in through there, that does not extinguish the public trust and the public right in a former sovereign bed of the water. And it still exists there, even though, say it's an Oxbow Lake, even though it is no longer a flowing river. However, what happens to that is highly likely that there's going to be some sort of sovereign territory issue if there is, in fact, navigability down that river. Again, I said, if that splits itself off and there is flow in both of them, all of a sudden now this is an island, it characterizes as an island, and we'll see what happens with respect to that. Let me get back. We're getting close here. I need to know where that is. There's that, and okay. Now, okay. By way of very quick review, and now, let's go. Okay. Give me a second. I think this will be worthwhile. I want you to know this is all being recorded for posterity, just to make sure I don't forget to do this next time. Second time around always helps, right? Okay.
And we're not even having to pay extra.
No. What a small thing a little plug-in can do. I think we're getting reasonably close. I think we were on, yeah, we were way past that. All right. Never let him see you sweat. Don't look too closely here. Yes, go ahead.
If there's now no water, it was navigable, does it mean now people can still take a walk on that stuff from Joe?
On the stuff from Joe? The answer is yes. Yes. There is a public trust that still exists and does not extinguish, even though there is some sort of evulsive change. Remember, evulsion change does not change where and what the boundaries are.
But Jane has to deal now with the people.
Say again?
But Jane has now to deal with people on her side.
Jane has a problem because there could very well be new folks rafting down the new channel, and it could be next to her goat farm. We just don't know what Jane's doing. Okay. Whew. So anyway, it doesn't bear too much resemblance now, does it? At any rate, so that is the problem. Historic channel, if it's non-navigable, the center is what the boundary are and where it is, and Joe is no longer a riparian owner. If that is navigable, the public trust and the public right does not extinguish, even though it is no longer a waterway, and there may be public issues and public rights over the new channel.
If the government doesn't want the old channel, can they just give it to Joe or Jane?
That's the interesting comment, and the answer is yes. Where the public trust is no longer valid or is no longer of any use, there is no navigation, there's no fishing, there's no any value, they can, in fact, abdicate their title and thus extinguish the public trust in it. That's true.
What value comes back in their link?
You know, you're starting to ask some questions that are very interesting, and I don't have an easy answer for you. I just don't. I'm sure you probably won't get that question asked on the test. I'm hoping. If you do, you can blame me. Yes, sir.
So what is the process for extinguishing it? The state lands have authority?
They do. They absolutely do. And they are the ones that have the authority to be able to convey rights, thank you, convey rights, take away rights, enter into leases, and assign the state's rights through the State Lands Commission to whatever entity it is. It can be another political entity. In Morro Bay, they have assigned leases and responsibility for Morro Bay in two different places across the line, one to state parks and beaches, one to fish and game. And those two agencies monitor what's going on and are responsible for activity in the bay. Okay. You have seen this all before. And by the way, we have an illustrious member of State Lands Commission, Mr. Evan Page, is here. He is my go-to guy when we have a lot of questions. Okay? You have seen this before. We are now in non-tidal but navigable areas. This is a navigable river. It does not have a head of tidal in through here, but just let's assume that there is some limit to the tidal influence. There is one up here. It says head of tidal influence right in through there. So what we're talking about is non-tidal but navigable still, and it's that little stretch in through there in public lands and running through a rancho. Also, non-tidal but navigable can concern a lake. It doesn't necessarily have to be a river or a stream. We'll talk about that as well. This, as we said before, and you've seen it, there's a public trust easement between the ordinary high water mark and the ordinary low water mark. We're going to start to get a little bit more repetitive so I can move a little quicker if things don't blow up on me. Okay, the rules. You've seen this again. Civil Code 830, except where the grant under which the land is held indicates a different intent, the owner of the upland, when it borders on tide water, takes to the ordinary high water mark. When it borders upon a navigable lake or stream where there is no tide, navigable, the owner takes to the edge of the lake or stream at low water mark. When it borders upon any other water, the owner takes to the middle. You've seen this before. You've seen it all before. Now, Code of Civil Procedure 2077, you have seen this before as well. I reiterate, when tide water is the boundary, the rights of the grantor to ordinary high water mark are included in the conveyance. Hark back to our discussion about ordinary high water mark versus mean high tide line. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And again, this is how you interpret ambiguous or uncertainty land title issues as well as title boundaries. I think we are fairly well cognizant of this fact, that the boundary between the state upland owners of non-tidal navigable rivers and lakes is mean low or low water. Let's go back. The state owns the bed. It's not about the water, it's about the land. Even if a meander line is present, ownership still extends to low water mark. The area between high water mark and low water mark is a shore zone, probably, remember the rancho that may or may not have a public trust overlaid on it. The shore zone probably subject to a public trust. Again, my focus here has been to provide you with some sort of an analysis or analytical tools to be able to say what might show up on a test. And so that's why I keep reiterating this, and I keep in my mind that little test that I gave you. More to come, by the way. Here's a sort of profile through this. Extent of upland ownership, okay? This is it. Remember, we are in a non-tidal navigable water boundaries. It could be a lake, it could be a river. Here it is. There is the low water mark. Somebody asked about how do you determine that? With much difficulty. It is, by its very name and nature, underwater because it's the low water mark. There must be high water mark. So there's been a lot of discussion and assistance from the courts about how to do that. Sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's not.
Do that survey in summer.
Exactly. Here is the extent of upland ownership to the low water mark. Here's the high water mark. What happened between the high water mark and the low water mark in these non-tidal but navigable issues? The state, remember, took title as a sovereign to ordinary high water. Why is that? That's because that provides more navigation, more capability for commerce, and that's what we were all about in 1850. Now, as of 1856, I believe, when 830 came into existence, they changed it because of certain administrative actions and because the legislature said, we're going to do this from ordinary low water mark, but it still overlays a public trust easement, high water to low water. You've seen it all before. Location of low water mark. And here's some of the criteria that can be implemented for this determination. It will be based on a mean or average or ordinary low water level. Again, the overriding concept of the courts is to be equitable, not to be special. We take words in their ordinary and customary meaning. We perform things according to ordinary, normal things that people do because that's what the courts represent. So therefore, we don't want any extreme high, extreme low. It might give inequitable title to one party or the other. So they say in the ordinary condition. It does not need to be the historic low point. In fact, many arguments about navigable non-tidal rivers, plaintiff always says, well, I own to the lowest point. That obviously takes their title out as far as it can be. That's not the case. It does not have to be the lowest point, but it is the ordinary low point. It does not take into account seasonal fluctuations. It needs to be a historic determination of however you can come up with it. I think I may have done this and added this. Lake County versus Smith, 1991. That's not that long ago, 20 years ago. Clear Lake. Everybody know where Clear Lake is? Clear Lake or Lake County? Okay. Plaintiff says, I own and I have a riparian boundary. It extends to ordinary low water mark. He goes out there and says, you know what? I want to fill it and I want to improve it. I don't need no permit. County says, oh, wait a minute. Yes, you do. And, by the way, we're going to sue for quiet title because we want to know where that is, whether you have a permit or not. So they do. The court goes through lots of analysis. The trial court, the superior court level says, you know what? You don't own as far out, which he claimed was like the lowest possible level. You don't own that because that's not the ordinary condition. And in fact, Lake County owns up to the ordinary high water mark at a specific elevation that has historically been recognized. It's 0 on the Rumsey gauge. That's a local issue. And what's more, since the early 20s, that particular method of determining where the 0 level is was recorded. They said that this gauge is the determinant, and they've been keeping records for 100 years. This gauge determines where that 0 level is. Superior Court finds for plaintiff, the county, and says even though whether you have a permit or not, your improvements or what you do in there still does not extinguish the public right. So there's overlaid again between ordinary high water and low water that public trust easement. Okay, navigability.
Why was the county involved in that? Why was the county involved in that? Why was
Because of the permitting agency. And this guy was doing some filling and some improvements without a permit.
you said the county owned it, but the state actually owned it, and the county came and
The county actually was the plaintiff in relation to the state, yes. Okay? Navigability. I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly, but navigability, as we've talked about, at law, to be recognized as navigable by the courts, must be navigable in fact. If you take a river, say, or a lake, say, what was this condition on September 9th, 1850? That is the day that we entered into the Union on equal footing with the rest of the states, and thus sovereign title inured to or was conveyed to the state. Okay. If it is navigable, the boundary is the low water mark. If it's non-navigable, title to the bed was not transferred to the state and remained vested in the United States and would be transferred with a federal patent. In other words, if a body of water there was not navigable, was shown on a GLO pat, it was the federal ability to transfer title along with whatever patents they give in whatever particular Lot 1, Section 6, Township 5 North, whatever the description is. And if it's non-navigable, the boundary is the middle of whatever stream that is. It's for navigability. The test for navigability. At law is navigability. In fact, conditions are the water needed to be susceptible of navigation. Can you do it? It doesn't have to have barges moving up and down every day. It can be susceptible to navigation. That means possible to convey commerce, and that will qualify as a navigational condition. It need not be continuous. I think we've seen this before, that it can be intermittent and even not present at the beginning and present now and still be considered navigable at law. And it doesn't have to be in an extraordinarily high state or level of the water, but at ordinary conditions. Quick question?
Yes, that takes into case seasonal.
Yes. The courts are trying to make this not an extraordinary condition that you have to conform to in order to make a determination. Navigability need not be easy, nothing ever is, but can be made in spite of obstructions. Remember the guy that had the broken levee, that had the trees and the tractors and everything, and all of a sudden now you got people fishing on it? Well, it was not easy, and in order for the peat barge to conduct its business and commerce, the guy had to cut another slice through the levee. So it doesn't have to be easy, just susceptible to navigation. Okay, meanders. GLO meanders. Briefly, this will come up, and it shows on your test. You will remember the test said there's a meander there. I think that what they were trying to do is get you to say, make a decision, make a judgment as to whether or not that meander meant something. GLO meanders. The conveyance is along the title of a bank of a body of water. A meandered body of water, and the meander used to show is not the actual boundary. It is meant to show acreage and the general configuration and not every sinuosity of a watercourse, and some of them are quite sinuous. And there still is, or may be, and I say maybe only because of the other sovereign condition, a public trust easement between ordinary high water mark and ordinary low water mark. Keep that out. Remember the question on every single question answer I had there was, is there or is there not some other title rights overlaid?
Yeah,
I just wanted to point out that for the test condition, this is going to be absolutely correct. In practice, you might want to look closer at the meanders were formed prior to 1855. They might represent a segregation line between swamp and overflow and more arable uplands. Generally, this is exactly what you want to remember.
We're going to show this in a second, and I'm going to bring that up. And that is a good point, Mr. Page. And again, my focus here is they're not trying to get into the nuances and small little details of the law on a test for the land surveyor's license. I think the general concepts that we're conveying here will be more than adequate to get you where you need to be, but we're going to actually show that. Okay. Other sovereign recognition, we have talked about this before. Spanish and Mexican grants are the same. The rules for Spanish and Mexican grants are the same for tidal navigable waters. Shoreline changes. The rules for non-tidal, navigable water boundaries for gain or loss are generally the same. Slow and imperceptible conveys additional tidal or to whatever you lose or gain. Avulsive, sudden, perceptible does not change what boundaries are or where they are. Land gained by accretion or lost by erosion also apply to access to public waters across private property. What's that mean? That means that given, I may even have a site here. I do. Bess v. County of Humboldt. Up in Humboldt County, I forget what the name of the river was.
Eel.
I don't think so. In Humboldt County, what happened was this. There was a piece of property along the river. The river flooded the property. The property was not habitable. The owner actually abandoned their structures on it and left. The water receded and receded sufficiently so that it was quite a ways away from where it used to be. So we have submergence, reemergence, we have everything going on here. Was it avulsive? No. But there was a road that was maintained by the county. It was in their county maintenance system. They claimed responsibility for it. The public had used it for a long time, for almost 40 years, without the express prohibition by an owner. And they had used it to get to the river. So when the river submerges the land, guess what? They don't have to go quite so far. But when it recedes, all of a sudden now they have to go through the property farther on this road. And the county had actually built a ramp to get down so people could go fishing. And now they're going across the property and even farther. What I mean to say by this is that gain, you might say, by accretion or recession of waters also extends that right across the property that the Bess people who said, we want to close the road. It's always about, I don't want you on my property. And so they tried to close it, and the court found that, no, sorry, there was actually a public dedication by virtue, a prescriptive public dedication because they've been using it for so long and the county was maintaining it. The point being is that if there is access, regardless of whether it's explicit, implicit, implied, however it comes about, and it is recognized by the courts in bona fide access, it extends along with any recession of waters or accretion or anything else. So that's what that court case is about. Well, you get the Hatfields and the McCoys going on a lot in these court cases, and some of it's pretty fascinating to find out, what Uncle Phil thought about the neighbors, and it's in a lot of these court cases. Okay, so I brought us to the end of non-tidal navigable water boundaries. Sir.
Just real quick, would say Lake Tahoe be under different rules since there's two states involved?
I'm certain it is, and I'm going to confess ignorance, in particular, about Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe probably has all kinds of overlays and all sorts of things dealing with its property boundary. It's a good question. I think I'll go back and I'll find out what I don't know. I know what I know, but I know I don't know what I don't know, if you know what I mean. Okay. I know. Now you know. Okay. Non-tidal, non-navigable water boundaries are starting to get a little bit easier because we're moving farther upstream. Okay. G, I think you've seen this before. And what we're talking about is these small little areas that pass above and beyond tidal and or navigable. We're talking about two riparian owners that have rights to and have water as their common boundary. What you want to know is the general rule, 830. Anybody seen this before? Okay, and the reason I bring this up is that when it borders on any other water the owner takes to the middle of the lake or stream, again, we covered under the basics definition of the middle and the thread and the thalweg, and I also confessed that there was one particular court case that defined the middle or the thread as two separate things under two separate conditions. So I do not claim to be able to resolve in one word unequivocally what that is. However, generally it's taken as the middle between the two banks. And if there is an issue that has to deal with riparian access, then it would be that location where the water at its lowest level would allow access to that water. All right. What you also want to know is the rules, Code of Civil Procedure. We've seen this before. And what have we seen that matters to us right now? When a road or a stream of water not navigable is the boundary, the rights of the grantor to the middle of the road or thread of the stream are included in the conveyance, except if something else is said. If somebody says, go to the sideline of a road, we know that it does not convey to the middle of the road because the intent is obviously not to include the road. The very same thing may be implicit or explicit in a deed that says, go to the bank of Mandamus River. If that's the case and it's explicit, then the courts say that is the, except where the road or thread of the stream is held under another title, and that very well may be the case, that it was not intended to be conveyed with the property. All right. Property adjacent to non-tidal navigable waters. Ownership's to the center, center is the midway or median. There may be a different intent expressed in the instrument of title for the boundary. If title indicates the shore, the boundary is the ordinary low water mark. I was reviewing this and looking at this. I think it was the Bess versus Humboldt County that had in it a judicial determination that since it didn't say what is the shore, that this is what they interpreted the shore to be, ordinary low water mark. There may be an access issue. I just talked about that very same case. It said if the access is across this land and the location of the riparian boundary changes, that will also probably change the location of the end of the access to the water. If title indicates a general term of river without an express intent, title carries to the thread. This came about because there was a deed that said, okay, go to and along the river. What's that mean? What is that? The bank, the upper bank, the lower bank? What is that? That court, in that instance, said if it means to and along the river without any other qualification, that means the center of the river, the thread of the stream. I use river in a term only for flowing water, and usually we get to these places and it's usually a stream or a creek or something of that sort. I think everybody understands. All right? The rules for gain or loss by natural accretion or erosion apply to riparian owners in non-tidal, non-navigable waters. Same thing. Slow and imperceptible means your title moves with that change in location. Sudden and perceptible means it's evulsive or whatever it is, and your title does not move with that change in location. All right, rules for gain or loss by sudden evulsive accretions, there it is. It does not generally change your line of title. Okay. We're into non-tidal, non-navigable water boundaries, and there's a couple of ways of doing that. Say you've got a stream or a creek, and all of a sudden you happen to be the lucky owner where something is accreted onto your land, and you have all of a sudden now you have some more land. How do you apportion that if you have neighbors that also experience that same thing? There's a couple of different ways. I've listed them. You can extend the lot lines, perpendicular to new frontage, equal or proportional area. What's all this mean? Words are good, I suppose. Here we have Mandamus River. You thought I made that up, right? Easy Acres and Easy Street. Say we have a subdivision. Well, this is extending the lot line. Is that equitable? I don't know. Maybe it is. But you see that this lot right here, that used to have a frontage right along there, now only gets a small portion of the accretion. These others get much more. Perpendicular to new frontage, well, that kind of makes an odd sort of configuration. It may or may not be equitable in area, and so other methods can be used to apportion any of those accretions. Equal proportional area. Did I actually compute this? No. Did I do it by eye? Yes. It was rather late last night. So anyway, so some of these in here, you use your creativity, and I think the overriding rule or overriding concept would be equitability. If it's equitable, I think a court, if you ever had to determine that, or if you ever got a question on the test that said, how do I do this? That would be the overriding thing in an equitable way.
Wouldn't it depend a lot on what your deed says? That if you have a deed that's, then north 50 east to Mandamus River, then you're just going to extend the line, and if your deed said something else, you do something else?
I don't know that.
What if it says the lot one of block such and such is a subdivision along the river?
And doesn't.
That's how they drew it.
That's how they drew it. You're getting into some great questions, and we're back to the other inference in the civil code and civil code of procedure, code of civil procedure that says here's how you interpret ambiguous things. Okay, if you have a lake, a non-tidal, non-navigable water boundary in a lake, there's a couple of different ways to do that. You've got the long lake method, the pie cut method. These things are tough to see. Again, we got Lake Wobegon. I got that from somebody else. And say, for instance, you have this small subdivision that has a riparian boundary. Well, if there was sort of a thread, you might say, of the lake, that is to say a center line that might be considered the bottom, you could apportion it that way, and so everybody gets those accretions. If, in fact, it was of a different configuration, you might be wanting to do the pie cut method, which relates all those lines out through there. Again, if it comes up and there is a question, I think mention of equitable solution would probably be a good thing to do. All right. That's the end of non-tidal, non-navigable water boundaries. Okay, one more coming down the stretch. Time check. Time check says, survey says, not bad. We're almost back on track here. Islands, swamp, and overflowed lands. And here's where we'll get to what we were talking about before. Okay. It's kind of hard to see. I have up here the section on islands, okay? What you want to know is the rules. Civil Code 830. We've never seen this before. Okay. I put this up here because it deals with navigability, and that is important on the nature and how title is determined when there are islands involved. What you want to know the general rules are Civil Code 1016 to 1018. We haven't seen these before because they deal specifically with island title, T-I-T-L-E. Islands and accumulations of land formed in the beds of streams which are navigable belong to the state if there is no title or prescription to the contrary. I think you could say that almost as an overriding qualification to everything you say in land surveys and title issues. And 1017, an island or an accumulation of land formed in a stream which is not navigable belongs to the owner of the shore on that side where the accumulations form. If it's not formed on, if not formed on one side, which very well may not be, it's apportioned to the owners on either side of their boundary, which is generally the thread of the stream. Okay. And if a stream navigable or not navigable, in forming itself a new arm, divides itself and surrounds land belonging to the owner of the shore and thereby forms an island, the island belongs to such owner. I'll bet we've seen this before. Remember, if this were flowing river there and flowing water there and flowing water there, what would be the nature of that land? It would then become an island. The definition of an island is something at ordinary water levels that is completely surrounded by water, and thus the graphic says that. So it's an island. What would happen to that? That would then be Jane's Island, because what's the boundary if this were non-navigable? Guess what? It's down and through there. So it would be her island. Now, as a hypothetical, what would happen if, say, well, actually, we'll get to that in a second. I think we have a graphic for that, too. Nature of title for islands is time-dependent. Islands present before statehood in a meanderable body of water, and I think we covered this before, and it had to be surveyed if the island was meanderable or not and shown on a GLO plat. All of a sudden, now we have the federal government doing GLO survey showing an island on a plat, and now it is available to be disposed of by the federal government in a patent or conveyed that way. If they couldn't meander the island itself, the instructions say tie the upstream point, tie the downstream point, and show it on the map because you can't get to it. Maybe it's flowing too fast, maybe it's during a time of year that it's inaccessible, maybe it just is covered with marsh, or I shouldn't say that, maybe it's covered with poison oak or whatever, and you can't get to it, then you tie the two ends. And it is available to the federal government, available for patent. In a meanderable water and it's not surveyed, even if U.S. parted with title to land adjoining the mainland. In other words, if it's not shown on a GLO plat, the federal government has patented whatever portion of it is that contains the water body within which the island was not shown. It's not considered in the bed of statehood. It remains federal, unidentified, unsurveyed federal land, and is still subject to disposal by the U.S. when identified. I don't think our little test had that situation, but if it comes up, it's something to consider and to be able to do. I think you'd get high points if you were able to elucidate those points. What's meanderable? Navigable rivers along ordinary high water is where they were supposed to meander. Did they do that? Probably not. Non-navigable rivers and streams when 3 chains or wider are in the instructions to meander. Navigable lakes at ordinary high water, non-navigable lakes of 50 acres or greater if authorized. That's a big non-navigable lake. Swamp and overflowed lands at the time of ordinary high water mark or ordinary high tide, not at the segregation line. This is what was brought up before. Before 1855, the instructions were not clear about what a surveyor, a deputy surveyor, would do when it came to swamp and overflowed lands. And I'm going to show you something that is confusing. After that, they were told to meander along the sovereign boundary. What is that? If there is navigable waters there, it is the high water mark. If it's navigable and non-tidal, it's at the time, the ordinary high water mark, because remember in 1854 or 6, 830 came into existence and said, oh, we're going to change it to low water mark. So that was the instructions at the time. What is a meander? It's a traverse that approximates the margin of a permanent natural body of water. It's for delineation and putting on a map. It's for computing area and not the boundary. That was sort of the little trick thing in that test that I showed you, and that was what it was meant to do, is to say, is this a boundary? Do you know that it is? Do you know that it's not? All right. Island present in 1850. It was, let's say it's meandered, shown, and it is public lands of the United States and can be distributed or sold, conveyed by patent. Or before 1850. Time dependent. After statehood, an island that emerges after statehood in a navigable body of water due to accretion. It's a natural process, remember. This is not sudden and imperceptible, which doesn't change certain issues. In a navigable body of water due to accretion is considered part of the bed and thus ownership vested in the state because it arose upon the bed of the property owned by the state. In a non-navigable body of water due to accretion, if on one side, and we just saw this on the Civil Code, 1018 says, guess what? If it's on one side of a river, then it's that person's on a non-navigable river. If it's in the middle, then it gets divided according to the tidal line. If it straddles the center, it's owned by both parties of opposite banks. Okay, here's the graphic for the situation. Navigable Green River, island forms in the bed of the river after 1850. There's the island. To whom does that belong? And in non-navigable Red River, island forms, to whom does that belong?
Private.
But if the thread of the river is right there, which in this graphic it appears to be, then both sides own it. If it happened to be over here, off the thread of the river, then that owner would own it in its entirety because it falls within their riparian boundary. S&O. S&O lands were considered undesirable. We talked about this, and uncultivable, and were to be segregated for purpose of exclusion of area. Back when all this was going on, we became a state. Land was valuable because it could be used for stuff. You could grow things on it. You could harvest timber. You could use it. You could plow it. You could plant it. You could do all sorts of things. And there was sort of well, I'll get into that in a minute. And it was undesirable because nobody wanted it, because I need to do work in order to make it recoverable. So it was segregated on some of these surveys, and I wanted to provide you with the definition of swamp. I take these, and these are italicized because they come directly out of a BLM glossary, verbatim. Low-lying land saturated with moisture, land at elevations below the upland, such as would be wet and unfit for agriculture unless you do something to drain it. Overflowed lands, again, verbatim out of the BLM glossary, lands which are annually or periodically subject to natural flooding. Natural is the key word here. During the normal planting, growing, or harvesting seasons. We're agrarian all of a sudden. Do we do that today? Is that such a concern today? No, but this is the basis of this premise. And lands which are annually or periodically subject to natural flooding and unfit for cultivation unless you drain them or protect them. Put levees or drain them. What is a marsh? A marsh is an area of low-lying wet ground. It's generally accepted as a salt marsh, usually and sometimes within tidelands. It may or may not be below ordinary high water mark. I have lots of these in Morro Bay. There are tideland surveys that cover this and sometimes include salt marshes because they are covered and uncovered by the ebb and flow of the daily tide, ordinary daily tide. In the cadastral survey usage, the word marsh has usually been used to refer to coastal salt marshes. All right, S&O. Okay, this is the last time I'll do this to you, I promise. This is the area that we are contemplating under swamp and overflowed lands. They are usually low-lying, but not necessarily next to a river or something, but usually are. They have tidal sloughs in here, and they may be subject to tide, but the meander line, if it is in fact public land or wasn't public land, it was meant to be the ordinary or show the ordinary high water mark. That is the boundary. The rest of it is segregated. It was unuseful, and generally it was given to the states through the Swamp and Overflowed Act of 1854 for Arkansas and other states to take care of that because they didn't want it. And thus, to the states, and the states could dispose of it as it saw fit under certain patents. Yes?
Is a segregation line like a meander line or a rough estimate of where it is?
I'm so glad you asked that. S&O determined by federal survey, and I'll show you here in a minute. If navigable waters are present, title and right of disposal belongs to the state. That is to say, there is a state boundary which deals with navigability or whatever it is that gives it to the state. Here is a swamp and overflowed lands in Solana County, and there's a map here. This is done by the county surveyor. He has what section and lots and township and range it is in. And then here's the field notes, and they give a description. This is it. This is the same thing as a modern-day legal description with an Exhibit B that shows the description. This right here was done in 1883, and land was conveyed according to this document. Somebody requested a survey for these particular lands because it was probably adjacent to their property.
So the feds gave it to the state along the meander line, and then the state gave it to private ownership with a different survey? Is that how that worked?
The feds gave the title to swamp, identified swamp and overflowed lands to the state,
The meander line.
as shown on the maps, with the meander lines? I'm going to tell you, the answer is, right off the top of my head, I don't know. But if they're identified as swamp and overflowed lands, whether the meander line was a segregation line or a tidal line, T-I-T-L-E line, that was what was given to the state to dispose of as they saw fit. And the state then had this done, okay, because originally they were segregated on the GLO maps, and this was what happened when somebody applied for a patent for S&O lands from the state, because the state could dispose of it, yes.
So then the segregation line is the true boundary, not just an estimate?
No.
No?
The segregation line only identifies the areas of swamp and overflowed lands. The sovereign title, if there is navigability next to it, is the what? Ordinary high tide line at that time, but later turned into low water. But now, the states own the swampland, which is shown with the segregated land. I'll show you this in a minute, which is why I said I'm glad you asked that. The states now could take that which was shown with the segregation line, keep what was theirs as title below ordinary high water line at the time, and dispose of it as they saw fit with devices like this. Okay, here is a GLO map. Again, this is it. This is the San Joaquin River. I think you've been working all along it, and I'm sure it's fraught with all sorts of complicated boundary issues. Not the least of which is where's the sovereign line? I mean, if it's adjacent to it. Notice that there's a river here, if you can see it. I'll blow this up in a minute, in through here, and there's also a line here, the segregation line. This was actually done, this was accepted in 1907, and I can't read that quite. So it was done late in the game. So
This was done in 1853.
this one, you know this?
Yes,
Oh, I love that.
this is the one I gave you.
Oh, yeah, you did, didn't you? And here it is in close-up. So therefore, this is the concept that Evan was talking about the confusion and the non-clarification of what it is the surveyor's supposed to do. And what they did was they ran along this segregation line, but really the title line is right in through here, at the time being ordinary high water mark, because they had yet to say, we're going to change these river issues down to low water mark. Okay? I'm getting a slow nod, but that's good. All right, that was the end of that. We're closing in on the end right here. I'm now down to a point where I'm giving you some useful books. I have blown through this as fast as I can and tried to get it done. I had to give this talk in an hour and a half before. I don't think anybody understood anything I said at that time. Here are some suggestions and stuff that are useful. Somebody came up to me and said, would you give me some indication? You did. Some indications of some useful resources and things like that. I'm not going to say that here's the be-all, end-all list of what it is that is good, and after which you will be arguing stuff in the Supreme Court. But here's a really good list of stuff to start. I'll give you some other information in a minute how to get this if it's not on the, and I believe it is in your CD. Glossaries for surveyors, I've used that and plagiarized that frequently in this presentation. Shore and Sea Boundaries, Volume 1 and 2 by Shalowitz. Aaron Shalowitz in the 50s was a very integral to understanding what and how the submerged land cases were actually adjudicated, and what the court wanted to know from him is, how do you figure this stuff out? Where do we go from here to there? River and Lake Boundaries by Simpson. That's a great book. It's not oriented so much for California, but it talks about a lot of lakes and rivers in their outside of California sense. It also applies here. Water boundaries, Cole. Mr. Cole has a very short, small, little book that talks about water boundaries with respect to Florida. A lot of this is useful because he gives practical ways of determining where some of these boundaries are. Remember where they are. What they are is a matter of law. Tidal datum planes, revision 1951 by H.A. Marmer. If you have a problem with insomnia, this is a great book to have. USACE Engineering Manual, they have some information about tidal boundaries as well. Yes.
How do you get those old books?
You know what? That's a really interesting question, and I have not the book, but I have copied it because I got my library at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo to go to interlibrary loan to somebody that does have it, and they sent it to me, and I copied it. Yes, Miss Ekehara.
I just donated that book to CLC.
Say again?
I just donated that book to CLC.
I am mad at you.
And it should be up for auction, or actually they decided I donated a box of publications that are up to 100 years old.
And they're down there now?
They're going to put them on eBay.
On eBay. Good. Oh, or not. Interesting. Wow. Well, if you were ever to run across this, and there's two versions, by the way, by H.A. Marmer, and this is the revision of 1951. He did one in 1935, and then it was revised in 51 to incorporate some of the technical updates and things like that. All I have is a loose leaf bound copies of all the books, and it's on eBay. I've been prohibited from going on eBay, by the way.
If they're out of copyright, you can get them on Google
Okay.
or Amazon.
Tidal datums in their applications. NOAA Special Publication NOS Co-ops 1. This is really interesting, and it'll tell you what applications you can use. It also is a fairly small book, and it's a technical publication by NOAA. Computational Techniques for Tidal Datums Handbook. This, well, again, if you're really weird, is a really cool book because it tells you how to compute local tidal datums from short-term observations at local areas. Tidal datums are all parochial. That is to say, they are all local. What is a tidal datum over here may not be the same datums and elevations over here. Currently, actually, I did some observations in Morro Bay. I have found some interesting stuff. The highs are approximately the same as the highs just 12 miles away. But in Morro Bay, there's a sort of a slosh effect, so they're delayed. But the lows are much, I wouldn't say much, but the lows are lower on a delayed basis. So therefore, what do we know? Ordinary high tides and other jurisdictional lines may change on shallow sloped lands if you find other tidal elevations. Anyway, so this is an interesting book that'll help you get from there to here to there if you ever choose to do that.
Is there a linear length for that?
Say again?
Is there a linear length for as far as you can?
Great question. The answer is yes, there is a linear length. It's about that far. However, having said that, what is generally done is I'm working here. I have a primary tide station up there. It says the elevation of mean lower low water is a geodetic elevation of 1. There's a primary tide station down there. It says the geodetic elevation is 0.5. I'm halfway in between, so I'm going to call my geodetic elevation of mean lower low water, not the mean lower low water elevation, of 0.75. That's generally what's done. As to whether or not that applies to inland waters or other waters affected by all sorts of things, that's your call.
As far as the coast, how far are those?
I'm sorry, say again?
As far as the coast, how far are those tides?
Interesting you should ask. If you go to the co-op site and NOAA site and you make an inquiry about tide data and tide datums on tide stations, and you go to the West Coast, the first thing you do is you can go to the West Coast and you look at all the tide stations. There are a lot of tide stations up in the Bay Area and north. There are a lot of tide stations starting with, I'm going to say, Ventura and south. Between Ventura and up in Monterey, there's hardly anything. But the changes are very small. San Simeon has a very small change from, say, Avila, and Avila from farther south. The changes are very minute, so therefore, my understanding says that NOAA, thought there was not such a need to be so precise with their determinations in these areas where it was open to the sea, and we are open to the sea. Restless Tides, that's a little pamphlet. It's interesting. I listed that because I had it on my shelf. Manual of Surveying Instructions, 1973, and the current one, 2009, as well. It's a really great thing, and it talks a great book, and it talks about tide and water boundaries. It talks about them and gives you all sorts of information. CLSA Water Boundaries Workshop 1976, if you happen to be fortunate enough to have this. And I think we ought to recirculate this through CLSA. There is a wealth of knowledge in that workshop. It's about yay thick. It was done in 1976. They had AGs, they had people from all sorts of just brain trusts for water boundaries and talked about all of it. That's a great book, or a great pamphlet. Miller and Starr, California Real Estate Third, section 848, 849, and 1512. Miller and Starr, anybody familiar with that? Okay, I'm going to go back to my little shtick that says, go to the law library. If you want to understand law and its premises, you need to get familiar with case sites. Miller and Starr is the Cliff Notes, excuse me, of legal cases. What it does is it takes a subject, water as a property boundary. Does that apply? And it takes all the statements and all the general statements, much like I've been giving today, puts them in there, makes the statement, and then substantiates it with case law and gives you all the case law on the site. So if you want to, then you go to the library. You either go on Westlaw, LexisNexis, something like that. You look it up, or you can go to the shelves and read the case sites. It is a remarkable thing, and it gives both sides. It is nonpartisan. It says the boundary on a certain body of water is ordinary high tide line, and it gives you case sites. But if it's close to something else, or close to within 2 miles of a incorporated city, then it's not really it's something else, and it gives you case sites, and it's very adept at doing that. Here's the next one, effective erosion, accretion, and reliction. So you read or go to the first one, you look at those premises, you go to the second one, and there are all the conditions of when stuff changes. And finally, the public trust, navigation and conservation easements. If you didn't suspect it by now, I think I will confess to you that much of what it is I have acquired and sort of compiled to tell you about came from those guys right there. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. They already gave it to me. Okay. That's some of the other things. What have we got? That's it. Never quit learning. You can write this down. Mr. Carrion says he's got an open door policy. My open door policy is the same. If you have questions or need information or something is lacking in whatever it is you do, my interest is to make sure you have it. There's some info. I have cards too, but I don't want to give out my cards because that sort of looks like I'm trying to trolling for work or something like that. But you're welcome to contact me at robert@reesesurveying.com and talk about something, get some information that you don't understand or anything else. And now, time check. Perfect. Everybody has a second envelope. And I hope you haven't opened it because if you like tests, there's not one in it. So go ahead and open your thing, and here's what I'm asking you to do. There are 3 questions. The first is, name at least one thing, and up to 3, that you've learned today that you didn't know before. The second question says, name at least one thing, and up to 3, that you're still confused about. Last question says, name one thing, or at least, or up to 3, that says, what would you like to know more about or more in depth? Fill these out. You don't have to put your name on it. Give them to me, not to the folks on the way out, because I look at them and I am going to edit what it is I do after I looked at the responses and everything else. Now, having said that, I really appreciate your input, and I think that's almost a wrap.